I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Susana Monsó. She's a philosopher, animal ethicist, and author of Playing Possum: How Animals Understand Death. Susana, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's jump straight into it with the title. I'd heard of the playing possum idea before, and I know that with fight or flight or freeze, they're the freezing type. So that's where this comes from. But in the book, you go into much more detail about how the response is actually elaborated. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so in the case of the opossum, um, when they feel threatened, they don't just freeze, but rather they engage in this very elaborate death display where they will adopt both the bodily posture and the facial expression of a corpse with their mouth open, their tongue hanging out, their tongue will turn blue. It's usually pink, it turns blue. Um, their bodily functions will decrease, so their heart rate and their breathing rate drops, and their temperature drops, and they also secrete this putrid smelling liquid from their glands. So they really like engage in this performance where they really look like a corpse and they stop responding to the world. So you would, if you didn't know in advance about their little trick, you would for sure be fooled by it.
Mhm. Yeah, that the smell seems really important for making sure they don't get eaten. Because I would imagine if I were a predator, like I see an animal playing dead, and it's just like, oh, cool, it's free food. It's not going to put up a fight.
I mean, yeah, but not necessarily because some predators will hunt and then they will cache their food for later. So I remember seeing recently a post on Blue Sky, I believe it was Ed Young who posted this a picture of I think it was a leopard up in a tree and it had like two gazelles stashed up in the tree for later consumption. So for a lot of these animals, these predators, especially if they're carnivores, they might not get that many opportunities to eat. And so if they see a prey animal, they might hunt it even if they're not hungry at that time, and they will catch it. It could happen that way, or it could be that the predator is killing more than one animal in a single go, and doesn't have time to properly check to see whether um, the animal is dead. Or it could be that they're just, disgusted by this animal. So, like, there are different kinds of ways in which feigning death can help you escape a predator. And I think the smell is important, but in some cases, some animals who just freeze, who just go into this freezing response, don't have such elaborate death displays. They might also be taken for dead.
Mhm. Another thing I learned from the possum example, this word Thanatosis to describe that death ritual. And then I was thinking about the etymology of it, the Greek Thanatos, the god of death, and then Thanos, the Marvel character, seeing how that all connects together.
Yeah, I'm not a Marvel person. I'm not familiar with the Marvel character, but I do know the Greek. And I do like this term Thanatosis. I think um some of the freezing responses that we see are also sometimes called Thanatosis, but I think it's better to reserve that term for a more elaborate death displays where you really see like an active mimicry of death.
Mhm. I bet the connection will come up again. So I'll give you the quick summary. In the recent Avengers movies, the Marvel movies, Thanos was the main villain, and his goal was to wipe out half of all life in the universe. So with a snap of death. So
Why did he want to do that?
it was kind of this utilitarian thing. Maybe that connects to your moral philosophy background as well. So the idea was look at all of these starving, suffering creatures across the universe. Everywhere you go, there's scarce resources. If we just wipe out the population in half, everyone gets double the abundance. That was his theory,
Yeah, I can think of some philosophers who might agree with that.
right? The ultimate utilitarian. But the interesting thing about the possum example in connection to the rest of your book is it doesn't necessarily entail a representation of death. Like you could argue that all of this is an instinctual behavior and the other animal perceives that it's dead, but the possum might not even know what it's doing. But then you list a bunch of other examples of animals, including some really simple animals that seem to understand death and have these elaborate rituals surrounding it.
Well, I wouldn't talk about elaborate rituals, but definitely I do defend in the book the idea that the concept of death is easier to acquire than has usually been presupposed, and that we can expect it to be quite widespread in nature. And the idea um with the opossum, I mean, the reason why the book is called Playing Possum, um, it's that the opossum's death display doesn't show us that the opossum themselves themselves understands what they're doing, that they have a representation of death, as you said. But the fact that these death displays exist in nature shows us that there's a concept of death in these animals' predators, which has acted as a selection pressure and given shape to these displays. So biologists sometimes use this example with the peacock's tail. So the peacock's tail tells us what the peahen finds sexy, right? We know this because I mean this tail is like it's it's maladaptive in certain senses because like it's makes it more difficult for you to run away from predators, but it's still worth having for the peacock because the peahens find it very attractive and are likely to mate with them. So this is giving us like a window into the peahen's mind, into what she finds aesthetically pleasing. Um, and with Thanatosis, what happens is we have a window into the predator's mind. So this is how the predators understand death. So they understand death as something that implies certain bodily postures, reduced physiological functions, certain smells, a lack of response, etc. So that's why this behavior is so interesting.
I love the peacock's tail sexual selection example. That connects to my own research in a way on sex hormones and brain development. And I have these interests in philosophy, and I've been thinking about the mental representation question, particularly of gender and of sexual attraction, because, well, for most species, they're going to be attracted to the opposite sex. So that implies that they have some sort of representation. And not only that, but that they have a representation of, say, maturity. And a lot of people argue, well, it could just be instinctual, like olfactory cues that signal fertility. So they might not even be representing something like sexual attraction. But at least in humans, we do. And that seems to be something that's innate. And then another example that connects to the sexual selection idea, it's this phenomenon of sexual imprinting, which is kind of like the imprinting that you see with chicks at birth. But some birds and some other species, they'll imprint basically on the first sexually mature opposite sex related species they see. So let's say you're a bird of one species, experimenters introduce a different bird that's opposite sex, but the wrong species. They'll imprint on that sexually and try to mate with them. And then the experimenters can reintroduce the correct species of birds and they won't be interested. So and that combined with the general imprinting process, that seems to be more mental representation itself. Like you have to be able to understand either what is my species or what is the thing that I'm attracted to be able to do that. And I imagine similarly for when you're representing whether something's alive or not, that's an even more basic category that must be represented somewhere.
Um, yes, but in a way, but I'm also inclined to think that most of the work is usually done, but by very basic mechanisms. So, for instance, we know that animals are um, like very simple animals, newborn chicks, for instance, or spiders, are able to distinguish biological movement from non-biological movement. Um, and this is something that is just so important because anything that moves in a biological way, so in a way that's goal directed and unpredictable, is much more important to monitor than whatever is moving non-biologically. By this, I mean, leaves shaken due to the wind or whatever. Um, so that sort of stuff already gives the animals some insight into the distinction between alive and dead, but that is not, I don't think it's going to be necessarily mediated by concepts or representations of alive and dead.
Mhm. The shaken leaves example is interesting because there's a developmental psychologist in my department, Liz Spelke. She argues about core knowledge, including core knowledge of animacy or of life, and that the heuristic that children use is basically if something is moving seemingly on its own, then it's biological. And the interesting thing is that includes robots, especially robots with faces like in the Cars movie. So children are more likely to personify those things. Um, and then if they can see some external cause, then they're more likely to assume this is just moved by its environment. But then with wind, well, it is external, but it's also invisible. So I could imagine a child or a simple animal maybe being tricked by that, but you're arguing here it's not, and even spiders can tell.
Yeah, yeah. I think they might become alert if they see sudden movement that they don't expect, but then they can very easily distinguish what is being caused by an agent and what is just caused by something like the wind. Um, yeah, and that sort of stuff is just it's so important for animals to monitor. It's just their life depends on it, regardless of whether they're predator or prey. And so it seems that it's too important for it to be dependent on learning, I would say.
I know, Susanna, you have a broader expertise in philosophy of animal minds and animal ethics. How did this emerge, and particularly the connection to thinking about death?
So I studied philosophy in Madrid, and then I went to London to do a master's in global ethics. And there I specialized in animal ethics. And as I was writing my master thesis, I realized that a lot of the claims that ethicists were making about how we should treat animals were dependent on certain ideas about the distribution in nature of certain cognitive capacities. For instance, sentience, that's like the most obvious example. Um, and I realized that a lot of these claims were made from the armchair, so to speak, without really engaging with the empirical literature. And that seemed to me to severely weaken the arguments. And I thought that if I wanted to do better animal ethics, I needed to learn about animal minds. And so I did my PhD in philosophy of animal minds. And I've sort of mostly stayed there. These days, I do always have like an eye on animal ethics, and I'm always thinking about those problems on some level, but most of my work is in animal minds. And I am interested in because I have this underlying interest in animal ethics, I am interested in cognitive capacities that have traditionally been used to separate humans from other animals and to argue that we are superior in some way or entitled to um, better treatment or to moral regard in a way that animals aren't. Um, and so this has led me to work on capacities like morality, rationality, and the concept of death. So this idea of a notion of mortality is, traditionally referred to as one of the uniquely human capacities.
On one hand, you show that it's clearly not, and especially as you get to social mammals like not only us, but other primates and even elephants and whales, that they have not only a concept of death, but like mourning and real emotions attached to it that aren't uniquely human, even if they're uniquely mammalian. But then you also have the final chapter that's unique to humans, and you talk about like culture and ritual and all these things about death that really are uniquely human. So How do you reconcile those when you're making the moral argument about, say, do humans belong in a different ethical category because we're so much more complex and we have more capacity for suffering and also capacity for joy? It's kind of related to the utilitarian thing we were talking about earlier.
No, I don't think so. So I think humans have a unique relationship with death, but in not in any way that makes this special, in the sense that other animals also have a unique relationship to death. You know, the opossum can play dead in a way that we can. That's part of her um, relationship with death. Or you have, like, I don't know, maybe vultures who can, detect death in a way that we can. Um, so I don't think that this means that we have any kind of special, having special, like, it's unique in certain ways, but I don't think that this is gonna ground any kind of moral superiority or anything like that. I mean, it does make us, I think that, like, our higher reflection capacities make us responsible in a way that other animals aren't. But so it gives us a responsibility to reflect on our actions. But I just don't see how it can ground, a special kind of, um, moral status or anything like that.
Do you know Walter White, another animal philosopher and expert in ethics and consciousness?
Yeah.
So we did a podcast a while ago, and we were talking about the ethics of meat eating, and not just in terms of hunting, but especially at the industrial scale that humans have it, where we really have monopolized the food chain. But usually, one of the arguments that I hear against it is on the basis of suffering, like both the suffering for the animal itself that's going to be killed, and then in this context where we're talking about social animals with an understanding of death, you could say, well, even if we're talking about a different one that's like waiting in line, but observing its peers being killed, that's added suffering that you have to take into the equation. So the core philosophy of it seems to be this either minimization of suffering or maximization of just general animal welfare. And also with this idea, so that's kind of utilitarian. And then I think you could have multiple forms of that because there could be something like human utilitarianism, which is we're going to minimize human suffering and maximize human welfare, but who cares about the other animals? And then there's the more general one, reverence for all life. And I'm curious about what underlies that philosophy. It's almost spiritual in saying like life has this inherent quality and we should have this reverence for life and aim to minimize suffering.
Yeah, I mean, I don't buy any of that. I mean, I think that's what leads you down the Thanos road.
Uh-huh.
I I I I think, minimizing suffering is important to a certain degree, but I don't think it's the only morally relevant thing. I think it's a severe simplification of the moral complexity of the issue to just boil it down to the suffering of the animals. I think there's so much more going on, so much more that's wrong with this practice than just saying that it causes suffering. Um, I think it's the problem is it's a system of oppression. I think the animals are born into, you know uh, a world where they lack all kinds of freedom. They don't have the freedom to choose to what to eat, who to hang out with, what to do with their day, where to spend their time, who to mate with. They can't choose any of that. They are not treated like the individuals that they are. They are instrumentalized. They are objectified. Um, they are turned into objects for consumption. And so that is the real problem. And the suffering. adds to the complexity of the issue. It makes it even worse because the animals, in addition, are suffering. But I don't think that that's what we should be focusing on. And I think it is very dangerous to reduce the problem solely to an issue of suffering. And it leads to very dangerous proposals, like proposals such as um, the idea that a good solution would be to genetically modify the animal so that they can't suffer. This has actually been proposed by some utilitarians as a solution to the plight of farmed animals. And I think this is a very, very dangerous road to go down. And so yeah, I mean, I don't think like a lot of people ask me that question, like, does your work imply that there's more suffering because the animals can understand it? And no, it doesn't imply that to begin with, because I don't think farmed animals are good candidates for a concept of death. There's no mention of farmed animals in my book, and that is intentional because farmed animals are raised in conditions where it's very difficult for them to develop an understanding of death. They are killed too soon before they are fully cognitively developed. They don't have the right kind of environment to be able to focus on what's going on around them. They can't develop the right kinds of bonds to other individuals. They can't develop the right kinds of attention to what's surrounding them. So I think it's unlikely that they're going to develop a concept of death. Um, I still think the slaughter is probably a horrific experience for them, but that doesn't have to be mediated by a concept of death. It may have to do with the smells, with the sounds, with it being a completely new environment, um, full of scary noises, scary looking people after having spent maybe 30 hours inside a truck where it's, you know, a million degrees and they haven't had any water or food for ages. And so there's so much there that can make that a horrific experience that they don't need a concept of death for that experience to be awful. But also I think it just doesn't really change anything, um, whether or not they understand death to the idea of it being bad for them to be killed. Um, there are many ways we can account for the harm of death without invoking a concept of death. And I mean, above all, I just think that's not our life to take. And I just don't think that they're treated like the sort of being that they are when they are instrumentalized in this way. So yeah, I would say, sorry, this is a very long rant, but I am just like very opposed to the idea that we should account for the wrongs here solely in terms of suffering.
Well, I'm curious about the metaphysics behind it, because again, it sounds like there's this idea of inherent value to life and an inherent, maybe set of moral rights that comes with that, like individuality and the freedom to explore your environment and choose a mate and so forth. Is that is what does the philosophy of that metaphysics look like? Like, where do those unalienable rights come from?
So I don't think it's a reverence for life, because I'm not sure that everything that's alive has moral status. I think we can think of certain things as granting moral status, but it's a different question. What gives you moral status to um, what determines how you ought to be treated? So um, I'm, for instance, quite on board with the idea that sentience can be what gives us moral status. So you begin to matter once things matter to you. Um, but I could also see the possibility of grounding moral status in agency, certain kinds of ways of engaging with the world, the ability to determine the course of your life as granting you moral status. But that's a different question from how you ought to be treated. And I think it's very easy to see that you can be wronged in ways that don't necessarily imply um, any subjectively felt harm. And some people don't buy this. They think if I don't feel it, then it's not harming me. Um, I mean, ultimately it boils down to intuitions, and I know that I can't really convince these sorts of people, but what I can do is kind of bring attention to the fact that this is this implies a very impoverished understanding of what makes a good life, where it's only a good life if you're feeling good. Well, no, not necessarily. Like I can think of many points in my life when I wasn't feeling particularly good, but my life was going well, and I would have agreed to that fact that my life was going well, even if I wasn't feeling okay. So, um, yeah, I don't know if that answers your
Uh-huh.
question.
Oh, it's kinda like the Greek eudaimonia, like, there's pleasure, but then there's meaning, even if the meaning you have to suffer for, like, when you're doing your PhD.
Yeah, yeah. It's that sort of thing. So the idea is a good life for me is a life that has many different things. And sure, it has to have some pleasure. I mean, a life that we're constant suffering for sure would not be a good life. So that might be sort of like a threshold condition. Like we need to meet a certain level of pleasure. But then there needs to be much more. Like a life where I'm just like hooked up to some heroin machine that's constantly giving me pleasure until I die. It's not a particularly good life. I need to have friendship. I need to have love. I need to achieve things. I need to have autonomy. I need to have meaning. All these sort of things I think have to be present. And a lot of these things don't necessarily give you a net balance of pleasure over pain. And I think it's very, yeah, simplistic or short sighted to think of it that way. If you think about, I don't know, like I've got friendships where I'm not sure that it gives me a net balance of pleasure over pain, but I still want this person in my life because they're my friend and I still appreciate that. And I think someone who went around calculating whether or not their friendships give them more pleasure over pain, um, wouldn't really understand what friendship is about. It's not really about doing these calculations. Um, it's about something else. And sometimes it has to hurt. Like I like to think of the example of grief. Like if you love someone and you lose them, you have to grieve because otherwise it wasn't really love. So it's like part of what it means to love someone
Mhm.
is grieve in their death. And sure, it's horrible to lose someone that you love, but it's also kind of awesome to love someone so much that you grieve their loss, to have experienced that, to have lived that. Um, so yeah, I think things are just much more complicated than you know people who want to reduce everything to pain and pleasure would like us to believe. And that means that theorizing about ethics is extremely complicated. I think one of the appeals of utilitarianism and a reason why so many people are drawn to it is that it's a very um, aesthetically pleasing theory because you need very few premises. You just need the idea that pain is bad, pleasure is good, more pain is worse, more pleasure is better. Basically, you have those two premises and you can derive the whole theory. And so a lot of people really like that, and I can see the appeal, but I think that we are relinquishing so much if we're reducing our moral lives to just that. So, yeah, I don't think it's worth it.
I'm also interested in the relationship between sentience and moral responsibility. So let's use the example of a predator. And most people wouldn't say that the predator killing its prey, and sometimes even a drawn out kill that might make them suffer more, because some predators can like to like play with their catch, that we still can't hold them to the same moral standards as humans, but humans are in a different camp. And when we're talking about something like meat eating, then it's because we're smart enough to reflect on our morals and also smart enough and have enough abundance to, say, gain our calories from other sources. Whereas the lion's not going to eat plants, it's just going to starve if it can't have meat. So that it's something like, as we've evolved, maybe even as we've evolved from our hominin hunter ancestors who could have had a more moral relationship with killing other animals, that there's just some it's almost like we've moved into a new evolutionary moral tier and now we have to operate by different rules. Is that the belief?
Um, I'm not sure I get what you're trying to get at.
Like,
Can
what
you
I'm
try?
wondering, well, it depends on who we're talking about. So I think I'm thinking about the types of people who argue that humans should not eat other animals for food, not only because of suffering, but as you're saying, because the animal itself has this right for a quality life, and the human doesn't have a right to, say, subjugate them just because we're more powerful. And then that that logic, unless it applies just to any sort of animal hierarchy, as in the case that it would also apply to predators, which I don't think most people have hold the same standard, say, to a lion. Then there's the question, what makes us different from lions? Is it something like, as we've gotten more sentient and more cognitively complex, that comes with it an inherent moral responsibility?
Yeah, I don't think it has to do with sentience. I think it has to do with a capacity to reflect on our behavior, and to understand the profound implications of what we do. Um, and I think that's what, makes our behavior morally wrong. The fact that we could do otherwise, the fact that we are understanding what we're doing, or we're choosing not to understand it, but we could. And that we can understand the wrongness of what we're doing. Um, I think that's where, moral responsibility and our responsibility to do better comes from. I don't think that that is applicable to other animals, um, at least with our current facts. Although I wouldn't say that animals are, or like, let's say, carnivores are moral saints either. I think that there is a certain moral quality to their behavior, that they do sometimes prolong the suffering of the prey, or they do have a certain amount of control over what they're doing, and they're choosing to kill in certain ways, or even that they're choosing to kill for fun. We have reports of animals such as orcas, for instance, killing other animals just for fun. And I think that this this sort of behavior is morally problematic in a certain way, in the sense that it can be described in moral terms. Like, if I were to put it in like plain language, I would say we can say that some of these animals are assholes, you know. Um, but that doesn't mean that we should hold them responsible and um, send them to jail or anything like that. In the same way that you don't really hold responsible a teenager for being an asshole. Teenagers are assholes, but they don't really understand what they're doing and the implications of what they're doing. They don't really have full control over their behavior. And that's why we can describe a teenager as an asshole, but we're still willing to let them off the hook. Um, so that's where I would place these animals. So here I'm thinking of a distinction that my doctoral supervisor uses, Mark Rowlands. He talks about difference between moral subjects and moral agents. So usually the distinction is between moral patients and moral agents, where a moral patient is a legitimate object of moral concern, and a moral agent is an individual who is morally responsible for her behavior and can be praised or blamed for it. But he introduces a third category, the category of a moral subject, where a moral subject is an individual who can behave on the basis of moral motivations, but who isn't necessarily morally responsible. And that's where I would place most animals. There are some reasons to think that they also have some form of moral responsibility or moral agency. like for instance, Dora Navidadi has defended. But um, for the most part, I'm quite convinced by this classification. And I think animals tend to, like many animals, fall into the moral subject category. Some humans fall into the moral subject category, but most humans fall into the moral agent category.
Mhm.
And that makes them morally responsible in a way that they aren't.
The some humans who are moral subjects, that might include children who then grow out of it, or maybe people with brain damage or something like that, where their decision-making capacity is limited.
Yeah, exactly. So some people lose their moral agency temporarily, or are still developing it. Some people lose it permanently. Um, they're still moral patients. Some of them are still moral subjects. Others may not be moral subjects. So, for instance, a person with permanent brain damage who were in this comatose state would not be a moral subject because she would not be capable of acting, let alone acting on the basis of moral motivations. But she would still be a moral patient because she would still have rights that we would have to respect. Um, but yeah, so I think moral subjects tend to be like children, certain mentally ill people, or people who don't have full control over their behavior or fully understand what they're doing. That can also apply to some of us, temporarily. Like, for instance, if someone who otherwise were considered a normal, typical moral agent, if that person were heavily drugged or heavily drunk, she might lose some of her moral agency temporarily, but we still could consider them a moral subject if they were driven by certain moral motivations, or certain moral emotions, for instance. So yeah, the category of moral agent, I think, is more like it's more fluid than is
Mhm.
usually acknowledged.
Yeah, I haven't heard these terms before, but it reminds me of all these fuzzy debates, including the whether it's psychopathy or brain tumors or even intoxication. Intoxication, I think most people can get out of because you say, yeah, but you made the immoral choice to get so inebriated that then you lose your moral agency. So it's still like past you has that responsibility. But then if you imagine you get drugged and it's outside of your control, and then you do something bad that sober you would never do, who holds the blame? I've never heard a satisfying answer to that. Same thing with psychopathy, like, or a brain tumor, where if it's due to some cause completely out of your control that causes you to behave immorally, most people say something like, well, it's not your fault in the moralizing sense, but it's still society's responsibility, say, to lock them up so that they can't harm other people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really not an expert on these kinds of debates, so I'd be wary of making any claims here. But I think it might be like I certainly find the category of a moral subject useful in at least certain senses. So, for instance, when it comes to thinking about human children, um, like we so often want to describe them in moral ways. We want to say this kid is so generous, she's so kind, or this kid is such an asshole. He's really selfish. She's a bully. And maybe we're talking about, 5-year-old kids who obviously aren't morally responsible for their behavior, but that doesn't mean that their behavior is like completely amoral in the sense of morally neutral. They can still be driven by certain motivations that have a moral character. And I think that applies to many, many animals.
That reminds me of another tangent, but it does connect more directly to your expertise on grief. So it has to do with how humans think of death, especially young infant death. And one case you could imagine is just it's instinctual. All mammals share the same care and pain circuitry that we've discussed. So any mother who loses her child is going to feel that intense grief. But then I've heard of other case studies of like cultural anthropology. The most extreme one that stands out is what would happen in Sparta in ancient Greece. And I don't know the specifics, but something about like basically if the baby wasn't deemed healthy enough, it would be thrown off a cliff. And, maybe people were still grieving that and that just doesn't get written into the history textbook. But what I've heard is it's almost like they considered it a miscarriage or like it wasn't ever a child to begin with because, it failed. Or in other cases, I think this might have been with Native Americans, there were these theories that, well, if a child died pretty early on, like before some later stage, maybe a year old, then it was considered like its spirit just went back into the earth or whatever the thing was, and it wasn't considered the same way that death was, like you're grieving it. It's just more like this was a different category of life that wasn't meant to last as long.
Yeah, I mean, those things are I think are super interesting. I again am not an expert at all on this, but I'd be inclined to think that this was a case of cultural learning somehow like taking over certain more instinctual reactions. So I think biology here plays a massive role in the sense that we are what's known as case strategists. So we are animals who have few few offspring, but our offspring are very dependent on parental care in order to make it. And I mean, it's a fact that a human pregnancy is 9 months. Um, it's a very big resource investment. And it's a fact that we are completely useless when we are born, right? We're dropped in the middle of the forest, we would die very, very fast. So we need parental care in order to survive. And, we need it for a pretty prolonged amount of time. And I think it's also a fact that babies are, like, objectively speaking, very annoying creatures who, like, constantly demand a lot of attention. They are constantly crying. Or, it's very, very demanding to take care of a newborn or even a young baby. So I think that there has to be a set of mechanisms that ensure maternal care. That just has to be there, because otherwise we would long have have gone extinct, right? And the fact that we're here, I think, proves that there are these mechanisms. But we're also highly cultural species, and I think culture may it's such a strong mechanism as well that it can intervene and it can somehow take over these other mechanisms or win over them, so to speak. I would be very surprised if in places like Sparta, there wasn't any motherly grief when they had to get rid of the babies, even if it's something that they understood they had to do, or it was honor, or I don't know, or maybe it was, other people in the family doing it for the mothers. But something that we see across many, many mammals is what's known as deceased infant carrying. So mothers carrying the remains of their babies for prolonged periods of time. And the reason why we see this is we see this in these animals who are case strategists who would normally take care of the baby. And if the baby suddenly dies, these mechanisms don't just disappear overnight. It takes them a while to disappear. It takes a while for the mother's urge to take care of the baby to disappear. And, some of these examples are just insane. Like, I talk about a lot of these in my book. There's a very famous example of an orca who carried her dead calf for 17 days and over 1,000 miles. And we're talking about an animal who doesn't have hands. A newborn calf is already like hundreds of kilos. Um, and this animal, like the calf can sink, it can float away, predators can take it. So the mother needs to balance it on her snout. She needs to regularly surface to breathe. She needs to keep eating and do this for 17 days. just shows us that the motivation is incredibly strong. And this seems to be very conserved, at least across mammals who are case strategists. We see this in many, many species. Um, and I think this is going to be present in humans as well, because we are like, due to the characteristics of our pregnancies and um, like our kids are especially dependent on us when they're born. They're born, like the theory is they're born a bit prematurely because otherwise they couldn't make it out of the birth canal. And they are just like, they just need this care. So that's too important for it to, for evolution to have left it to, the fate of like whatever is a cultural trend in this species at that time. That doesn't mean that certain societies can't have these like alternative ways of understanding it, but I think the mechanisms are still going to be there.
It's interesting that not only do we have this care that's long lasting, even after death in some cases, and these cultural moral rituals for it. It's not only a positive motivation, but if you don't do that, people consider it disrespectful. Like you could imagine just this rationalist case of, okay, the body's dead, the person we actually cared about is gone, so just discard the body. Who cares whether it gets buried, whether you have this funeral? But that would be seen as disrespectful. I don't know if it's more about it's so much for the dead person who you want to respect, because a lot of cultures you'll have this spiritual take on an afterlife, or like somehow your behavior is going to be translated to them, or if it's just social signaling to the living, like to show. I mean, this is kind of a cynical take, but almost like virtue signaling, that to show how much you care about the person, you're going above and beyond to do things that no longer benefit them just because you're showing how caring you are.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the it's one of the issues on which I think the utilitarian um standpoint fails to see the more complexity of the issue. And I mean, for a utilitarian, they might talk about virtue signaling, they might talk about, uh, not wanting to shock people, whatever. Um, but I think for a lot of people, it has to do with respecting the body of this person, and they see it as a wrong to the person, even if the person is no longer there to subjectively feel it as such. Um, I think a lot of people, like in the same way that a lot of people would feel that if they didn't keep their the promise that they made to their dying father on his deathbed or whatever, they didn't keep it, they would be wronging their father, even though he's no longer there. I think for a lot of people, the way they conceptualize is this: no, we're wronging this person, even if this person isn't there. And I mean, that's how I like to think about it. And um, it just, adds to this moral complexity of what it means to treat someone respectfully. Um, but I think there are just things that we feel that it's not okay to do to a body, because a body is not just it's not an object. It's the body of a person. And so, it's not okay to dress it up in like ridiculous clothes. It's not okay to hang it off a bridge or throw stones at it or whatever. There are things that would like severely shock us if we saw someone doing it to a dead body. Um, and I think it's because we feel that dead bodies ought to be respected.
I'm interested in your take on how cross culturally, to my knowledge, universally every human society, when thinking about death, there's some notion of afterlife, even if you don't believe in it. Like you could say in secular Western society, it's still inherently tied to the notion, except the argument turns into there isn't one. But it's not like it's not part of the conversation. And I mean, I can think of two theories. One that's popular is the Freudian death anxiety idea, that it's something like a narrative defense mechanism because it makes people feel better to think that the person who's no longer there is going to live on in some form. And then tied to that might be this innate dualism that we have, where we think of body and mind or material, and then the metaphysics of morality or even mathematics, like all of this stuff that just it certainly exists, but you can't point to physically. If it's some sort of artifact of that, almost like a spandrel, that you can't think about ephemeral qualities like making a promise without also, as a side effect of that, having some sort of theory of the qualities of a physical person that persist after the body's gone.
Um, yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to respond to that. I mean, I'm not an expert in cross cultural stuff or in humans in general. I don't really think much about the human perspective on these issues. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess there can be like different accounts for why we think that it's wrong to disrespect a human body, um, that don't necessarily have to do with the afterlife. Um, but yeah, I'm sorry, I can't offer a more concrete response to that.
Okay, so to turn to animals, even with animals, you see the same sort of paradoxical relationships like with dogs. In some cases, you get the dog that's the man's best friend, and long after they're gone is waiting at the same spot and just loyal and grieving. And then in other cases, the pet will just eat their owner because no one's been there to take care of it or feed it. And maybe you could say that both can exist. Like maybe the pet who's eating their owner feels bad about it, but is just starving. And it's like the humans who are lost at sea and cannibalize each other. Maybe it's something like that.
No, I don't think it's like that. So I talk about dogs who feed on their owners in the book, and it doesn't seem like it's done out of hunger. So in at least I believe it's a quarter of cases they do it while they still have food in their bowl. So it's not motivated by hunger. If you look at how the behavior happens, um, dogs who are free ranging, they're hunters and they're also scavengers. And they usually, if they come across a dead body, they will feed on the torso because it's where all the nutrient rich organs are. But when they feed on their dead caretaker, what they usually feed on is the face. That's what they usually eat. And this is very interesting because our face are like our communicative center. It's what they usually pay attention or the most attention to because it can signal so much about our our current state of mind. And this points to the idea that this behavior is born out of concern for the owner's lack of response, where the dog is trying to get a response from the face, which is where they usually would reliably get a response. Um, and when they don't, they might get frustrated and they might start to lick in order to calm themselves down because something dogs do, they calm themselves down using their mouths. So they might start licking the face and then eventually nibbling, drawing blood, and then, one thing leads to another. Um, so I don't think that this is necessarily them. I don't think that they have to feel bad about it because, I mean, that's a very like anthropocentric, not even anthropocentric, but weird centric way of looking at it because in certain human cultures, they eat their dead as well. So, and I don't think it necessarily needs to be construed as something disrespectful. In some societies, it's actually very respectful to eat your dead and to like incorporate that person into yourself. And it can be done out of respect and it can be done in a way that is loving and caring and respectful for that person. I don't think the dog necessarily conceptualizes it in either direction. I believe that the behavior is probably born out of love from their owner. That's like the root of the behavior. But then at some point it's very instinctual where they are just tasting blood and they're just eating and they're not really thinking about what they're doing. Um but yeah, I don't think that means that they love the owner less.
Mhm. I have a really mixed response to that. You know, there's the part of it that's sort of reassuring and comforting, like, okay, maybe it originates out of this concern and that's why they're targeting the face, but then it's also just disturbing that they're targeting the face.
Yeah, I mean, there is something deeply disturbing about this. I mean, I always talk about this whenever I give a talk on these topics, and I always get like a very it's I do this mid talk, and it always sort of wakes people up, and they start to like giggle very nervously, and like you can tell that there's something deeply unsettling about this idea that their dog might eat them. Um, and it is deeply unsettling for us to imagine a face being eaten, also because I think disfigured faces are something that is deeply traumatic for us to see. And so I think we have like, a lot of difficulties reconciling that with the idea of love. But that just might, be evidence that it's hard to take off our anthropocentric glasses and really see the world as other animals might and fully understand other animals' motivations. Yeah, but I mean, we do have a lot of scientific evidence that dogs love us. It's something that's very well established scientifically, apart from all the like behavioral evidence that any dog caretaker has. Um, so yeah, it can't be that they're just seeing us like as a walking piece of meat that they're just hoping is gonna croak soon, to be able to take a
Mhm.
bite. I don't think that's a plausible explanation for what's happening.
What do primates do with dead bodies in their troop?
So it depends a lot on who has died. So usually if who has died is an infant, usually the group doesn't pay much attention to the body and only the mother pays attention to it. And so the mothers will very often carry the remains for hours, days, weeks, even months. Um, that will sometimes happen. Sometimes the mother will decide to eat the baby, and then, it becomes something edible and it becomes food, and then it gets sort of shared across the group. That can happen. Sometimes, if the one who has died is older, it's when we see more interesting behavioral reactions when the individual who has died is bonded to more individuals in the group apart from the mother. Um, that's when we see, all kinds of behaviors. Sometimes we see very subdued reactions, very observant, investigative. Like maybe they will touch the corpse, they will sniff it, they will um sit around it and observe it. Or sometimes we see violent interactions with the corpse that have been postulated as attempts to gain a response, maybe born out of frustration for lack of response. We see some animals who will attack the remains or engage in like dominance displays and use the body as a tool. Um, and then we've got like interesting cases. There was one very famous case of an adolescent chimp who had died, and then there was this female in the group who he was very bonded to. And once the group had sort of lost interest in the corpse and they had left, she stayed behind and she grabbed little grass stem and she began to clean his teeth. And she spent like
Hmm.
a while just like carefully cleaning his teeth, which is like super interesting behavior. Um, So yeah, it depends a lot on who has died and how the others feel towards this individual.
What about in pair bonding species? Do you see a unique response specifically from the partner?
Um, I haven't come across any studies on this. I mean, there's anecdotal evidence that there is like a very strong grieving response on behalf of the animal who's left behind. Um, but I don't think it has been like studied systematically. I mean, in general, these phenomena are very difficult to study systematically because there are ethical constraints, thankfully, in place, and um, it's not that easy to get evidence. And so a lot of the studies that we have are very anecdotal in nature, just opportunistic. Like maybe there's a group of field researchers just observing a population, and there's a death, and they happen to be there and see the others react to it, and they publish it in a report. But yeah, a lot of it remains unreported.
Yeah, there's something related to that morality and the respect for life idea there, because I'm thinking about prairie voles when thinking of pair bonding, and there's tons of neuroscience studies on them and how the oxytocin system works to mediate pair bonding. And in most of those types of studies, it ends with the animal being euthanized so that you can dissect their brain and look at whatever thing was being manipulated. But then the thought of doing a study that's like we take the pair bonded voles and specifically kill one and then observe the other's response, even if you're later dissecting the other one's brain or dissecting both their brains in a similar way, there's something that just feels worse about that. Even if, say, the total amount of animal lives taken was the same for any other study, it feels almost more cruel and wasteful because you're specifically evoking the response to death.
Yeah, I mean, I never thought about that, but yeah, I think, I mean, there's definitely a dimension of cruelty there. I think scientists often lose sight of the bigger picture of what they're actually doing, um, which has to do with the way that the scientific system is set up. This like publication rat race that we're all immersed in, and um, you know, having your whole mind focused on this very small problem, and not really seeing the bigger picture of what you're doing. And there are a lot of examples of that, of like these experiments where if you really stop to think about it, it's like, wow, it's actually pretty cruel.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, I like that bigger picture motif to close on because I imagine you might have encountered this. If you write a whole book on death, people could have a weird response to that. But then as this conversation has unfolded, I see how it connects to all these other interests in morality and consciousness and biology, comparing species, different social responses, and so on.
yeah, I think talking about death, it's just an excuse for me to really like reflect on these different ideas from this particular angle. But it has made me reflect on a lot of things, from like how animals perceive the world, how they start learning about the world, how they conceptualize it, how they react emotionally to different ways, how they bond with each other. And this in turn leads to a reflection on what a good life looks like for an animal, for different animals. And um, yeah, I think in the end, all these other questions are connected to it, and death is just like a particular angle from which to look at it, but it definitely connects to many other
Mhm.
questions.
Thank you so much for sharing, Susanna. And I encourage listeners to buy her book, Playing Possum.
Thank you so much.